Hello and welcome to the DN News. We are here on a roundtable conference organized on an international platform to discuss about the non-political critique on Euro-Centric model of the Indian democracy. We have here with us renowned speakers and researchers to speak on the issue. We will now introduce one by one, and the speaker, the main speaker, Mr. Sumit Kumar, who is going to actually present the talk on the topic. And based on the topic, we have to interact, we have to give our opinion, we have to speak on the issue and have a good, healthy discussion on the topic that we have. We are now today going to discuss on. So welcome all of you, and to introduce and start the program, I hand over the stage to the host, Miss Hemanta Sriram. Hemanta, are you there?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, Hema, can you please start the program now?
Yes, sir. Sure, sir. Thank you. Great and happy day to all present on this prestigious platform of International Roundtable Conference on non-political critique of the Euro-Centric model of the Indian democracy. Now, I invite Dr. K.C. Bindu, Associate Professor and Head of the Department of Education, Mother Teresa Women's University, Kodaikanal, Tamil Nadu, India, to address the conference.
Okay. Respected Vice Chancellor of our university, respected Register, Control of Examination, Dean, and all the head of the departments, my department, Webinar Director and Chairperson of Tejasvi Asmita Foundation, New Delhi. Fellow participants, guest speaker of Roundtable Conference, it is my privilege to welcome one and all to the Intimation Roundtable Conference on Democratic Truth, Non-Political Ethic of the Euro-Centric Model of Indian Democracy, organized by Department of Education, Madrasa Women's University, Non-Political Critique of the Euro-Centric Model of Indian Democracy. Welcome the speaker, Sumit Kumar, social scientist and a researcher at Budapest, Hungary, in collaboration with Mother Teresa Women's University, Kodaikanal. I wish all the best to success of the roundtable seminar. On behalf of Mother Teresa Women's University, Department of Education, I welcome one and all present here. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I cordially invite Dr. P.B. Beulah Bensi, ma'am, Assistant Professor, Department of Education, Mother Teresa Women's University, Kodaikanal, Tamil Nadu, India, to explain about today's conference. Thank you, ma'am.
Honorable Vice Chancellor Professor Dr. Vaidehi Vijaykumar, respected Registrar Dr. Hilda Rani, revered Controller of Examinations Dr. Palmiri Deborah, Dean, Head of the Departments, and my Head of the Department and Webinar Coordinator Dr. K.C. Bindu, Webinar Director Dr. Sri Vatsavidhi, Founder and Chairperson of Tejasvi Astiva Foundation, New Delhi. Dear participants, learned academicians from various institutions from India and abroad, guest speakers of this International Roundtable Conference, my dear colleagues Dr. B. Ranjini, Dr. T.S. Reena Ruby, Dr. C. Renha Devi, and research scholars and students, a very warm good afternoon to one and all present in this forum. It's my pleasure to introduce the topic of discussion of the International Roundtable Conference, the democratic truth, non-political critique of the Eurocentric model of Indian democracy, organized by the Department of Education, Mother Teresa Women's University, Kodaikanal, in collaboration with Tejasvi Astiva Foundation, New Delhi. We know we are in a democratic country in which many of the notions such as citizenship, human rights, popular sovereignty, democratic government, and independent judiciary are based on the principle of national self-determination, which is the bedrock of the nation's state system. In this forum, we can have a strong discussion on the worldwide view of Eurocentrism and Eurocentric model by our eminent stars of Yorkshire Laurent University. I hope it will be a healthy discussion which will be very useful for the participants, particularly who are from the law university and the law students. Thank you, and I welcome you one and all to this forum. Jai Hind.
Hema, are you there?
Hello. Thank you, ma'am. Now I invite Srivastava sir, founder chairperson, Legitimacy Foundation, New Delhi, to give introductory remarks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Hema, and welcome all the esteemed speakers here on this platform where we are going to discuss on a very major issue, the non-political critique on the Eurocentric model of the Indian democracy. Actually, I am a human rights activist in Delhi, and I am involved in day and night human rights problems and its redressal. I am watching everything very minutely at the ground level. So for me, democracy means something different, and what is being practiced today is something different. So this came in my mind that what actually is the problem behind it? What actually could be the reasons behind the failure of such a huge democracy in the world? And I requested Mr. Sumit Kumar to give his deep study onto this and let us know something so that we could suggest something to the people of this country and to the government of this country also. And that is how this roundtable conference was arranged between me and Mr. Sumit Kumar. I think last about 8 to 10 months we have been discussing on the issue to find out the actual reasons of failures of most of the major points and places in the democracy. Why the Indian democracy is not successful, why people are not happy, why people are not having all what they need, why they have to beg, why they have to beg for education, why they have to beg for food, why they have to beg for life, why they have to beg for health. All these issues are major issues unless these are redressed and everybody is enabled to go and have their rights directly from the government, from the hospitals, from the institutions. Till then the democracy will not be 100% successful. So we discussed about this, and then I think Mr. Sumit Kumar has reached some fair conclusion about explaining about this problem, and that is how we are here today. Not taking much of your time because we have very limited time here, and I think only we have 3 hours in hand, so I will not like to waste the precious time of all the esteemed speakers sitting here, and like to know and hear more about this from all of you. So right now, I would request Dr. D.K. Satsangi, who is a very senior professor in All India Institute of Medical Sciences. He is a cardiovascular and thoracic surgeon, and has, I don't want to say more about him, but Dr. Satsangi is a person who has performed 25,000 lives open heart surgeries till date, and all of them are successful, almost all. And so he earns a very good reputation and name and fame in the entire world. I would request Dr. Satsangi to please speak a few words about the topic and enlighten us about most of the things that you know on this, because you have been working with the government, with the people in so close connectivity that you may be able to explain us little about it, and then we'll carry forward with the program. Dr. Satsangi, can you please take over?
Yeah, in the beginning, I would thank you for inviting me in such an important discussion. and very relevant today's time. We all know that when India became independent, we chose the democratic pattern of government. Unlike our neighbor Pakistan, who tried to be democratic and then went into military rule. And we were very sure that this democratic pattern of government, this government of people, by the people, for the people, will suit us. And before us was the example of United States of America, which was also a democratic setup, and the government by people, for people, of people, very much suited it. And the States of America make a tremendous progress and became #1 country in the world. Now this democracy was nothing new to us, not new to our country, because even in Vedic time, though there used to be a king and there was a monarchy, but the democratic system was very much prevalent, and actually it was democracy because everyone has a right to express his opinion and to lead his life as per his choice. He was fully independent. And even in the court of the king, there used to be courtiers, there were wise people, there were his advisors, the people, wise people who used to manage the country, and even a common man has a right to express his view and even to criticize the king. And that is how we became a democratic power. And I am proud to say that we are the largest democracy on the earth. And though most of us are not happy, I particularly feel that when we were struggling for independence, and on the scenario, one side there was Mahatma Gandhi, who was later termed as the father of nation, and there was Dr. Annie Besant also, who was the first president of Indian National Congress. And in fact, she was the one who initiated this movement, the Freedom for India. And that is when Mahatma Gandhi, supported by all other leaders, they introduced the non-cooperation. To that, Dr. Besant said that non-cooperation is a bad weapon. And she said, if we introduce this in the latter time to come, we are going to face a lot of indiscipline and unrest and chaos while administering the country. And saying that she resigned from Indian National Congress. And so this was the first instance. Second instance was when the British offered us the home rule, and they gave us so we refused that. That was to begin with. And then there was the offer of dominion status. And dominion status, Dr. Besant was very much in favor of dominion status. And all other countries, as we see, including Canada and Australia and New Zealand, they happily accepted that status. But our leaders said that we want the full freedom. And they started the Quit India movement. And to that, Dr. Besant said she was not happy, and she said that India's freedom has gone. Another 20 years we have lost. And in 1947, exactly 22 years after her, remarks, when we gained our freedom, that freedom was not a very welcoming freedom, because we all know that that was a very difficult day, and there was, the India was divided into the two countries, and many people were massacred. I said the millions of people became homeless. They had to leave their place, their home. Their children were massacred. The ladies were insulted. So that kind of freedom was not very welcoming. But today, when we become, a separate country, three separate countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. In India, problems are still there. And still we are facing every day somebody going on a strike. Somebody is, is going to stop all our trains. Now we are facing the Kisan movement. And I am sitting here in Greater Noida. I can't go to Delhi because all the borders are blocked. And sometimes, there is another reservation movement is there. They will sit on the railway track, will not allow the trains to move. So this is all a kind of anarchy, I would say. And sometimes we feel that how come government is so helpless? They cannot open the roads for us. They cannot open the border for us. If they stop the train, we cannot run the train. What kind of system is it going on? And whatever we dreamt and we said that we are heading for a Suraj or Swaraj and our country is going to be heaven, but we find it's all chaos. So many people have started questioning whether we are fit for democracy or not. Though many thousand years ago in the Vedic period, the Aryans were so advanced that they were running democracy successfully in our country. And many thousand years after that, we have gone so much of back that we cannot be a democratic country. Many people say that democracy is not suiting to us, but that kind of comment doesn't solve the problem. If democracy doesn't suit us, then what will suit us? What is the alternative? So I am eagerly looking forward to hear the learned speaker, Dr. Sumit Kumar, and let us see, because he has done research on this, he has authority on democracy, and I am eagerly looking forward to hear him on this point. I hope he will come up with some solution. Thank you very much, all of you. I thank all of you who have gathered to participate, and I welcome them all in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Actually, whatever you have said is absolutely right. That we don't really understand why government is not able to clear the roads and why government is not able to manage the whole issue that is now cropping up every day in the education sector, in the health sector, in many other sectors also. Socially, there are a lot of problems everywhere, in the downtrodden community, in the educated sector, in every sector there are problems. But we also need to know why the government is helpful in providing all kind of support to the people of this country. Why the government is not able to provide all assistance and all kinds of facilities to the people of this country, because as per the constitution, the government is liable and responsible to provide each and every facility and opportunity to the people of this country for the development of this nation. What I personally feel is development of this nation will not work. It will work only if the development of this nation is in true sense. We have to work on those lines. That is the main issue. So we'll come back to you later, sir. Please don't go away. Please wait here. Let us hear first Mr. Sumit Kumar, what he has to say, what does his research say, and then we will discuss with him, and we will maybe ask some questions also on which we really don't know much about it. So Hema, what is the next program?
Introduction of keynote speakers, sir. I'm going to.
Okay. So we move ahead now to introduce Mr. Sumit Kumar, who is the main speaker today on this topic. So he is going to speak, and then we will all the expert speakers sitting here, expert panelists who are sitting here, they will all comment on that. They will all put their point of view and then raise questions and discuss on the platform. So that's why we call it a roundtable conference, so that we interact one-to-one. Whenever we have a question, we'll ask Mr. Sumit Kumar, and what he has to say about it, we'll know from him. So I go straight to introduce Mr. Sumit Kumar. Sumit Kumar is
Thank you very much.
researcher and faculty. It was Lorand University, Budapest in Hungary. Mr. Sumit Kumar is conducting research on rationality of state and state institutions from Eötvös Lorand University in Budapest, Hungary, which is one of the oldest universities in Central Europe and boasts of 5 Nobel laureates amongst its alumni. His main focus is on the normative development of a non-Eurocentric model of democracy, which can be structurally rationalized with an idiotypical model of bureaucratic institutions that constitute late modern states like India. Over the last 2 years, he has developed concepts like paradox of institutional responsibility and of structured rationality, and in applying these concepts to the state institutions, he has developed a unique perspective on the deficits of the Eurocentric model of democracy, which is established in India. In the past, he has worked as a project manager for more than a decade in India and abroad. He has bachelor's degree in physics, a master's in business studies, and is currently teaching organizational sociology at Eötvös Lorand University, Budapest in Hungary. I think with this, Mr. Sumit Kumar's education, capabilities, and his knowledge can very well be understood. And I would now request Mr. Sumit Kumar to please carry on with his talk and enlighten us about the topic which we are now going to discuss here today. Mr. Sumit Kumar, please.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you very much for the extraordinary introduction. I don't think I deserve as much as you have said about me. I will try my best to be as you suggested. I will try to be as detailed in my criticism as I can possibly be. But before I start, I would like to thank the organizers, Mother Teresa University, the Vice Chancellor and the Registrar, Dr. Bindu, Dr. Bensi, Mr. D.N. Srivastav, the founding chairman of the Tejasvi Astita Foundation, Professor B.C. Nirmal, who probably couldn't join us today. Dr. Satsangi, thank you very much for the introductory address. I would also like to thank Professor Giri, Dr. Sudhakari, and Professor Vinita Gupta, who are probably in attendance as well today. I also would like to thank my colleagues and my professors from Eötvös Lorand University, Professor Anna Wesley, Professor Frank, Professor Estepal, Akosh Koppar, who is also my supervisor, and everybody else who has joined in. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak today. I'm going to start with my presentation on the non-political critique of the Eurocentric model of Indian democracy. Can everybody see the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So to start with, I mean, the first thing that I would like to say is that my topic, as it says, it's non-political, and I'm going to describe what non-political is in a short while. I'm also criticizing it from a Eurocentric point of view. The criticism does not mean that Eurocentrism is bad. I do not mean to say that it is bad. I am just criticizing it from that point of view. And specifically, I'm going to talk about democracy, and it would be a sort of an epistemological critique. And By epistemology, I mean interpretation of knowledge, how we interpret knowledge, basically, in short. So let's start with non-political. What basically is non-political as opposed to what is political? Um, in terms of the public sphere, how am I saying public sphere? Political would be a state of conflict in the public sphere, where people have conflicting opinions about different things, and they are always in a state of conflict. And that's what that's what gives rise to political competition um, in modern democracies, and that is something which is very important if a democracy needs to function properly, that political competition aspect. And that is why it's a thing that is very important. It's something which is very integral to democracies, that there should be competition, and there should be political opinions, differing political opposing political opinions, which must be able to freely compete in the public sphere in democracies. As opposed to political competition, there is also another term that a lot of people use, and that is post-political. Now, I'm not using a post-political critique, and the post-political critique would be something which would be uh, a state of sort of consensus within the public sphere. And the criticism of that post-political state is that it is more or less a liberal hegemonic state, and that is a leftist criticism anyway. But it is a fact that yes, in a post-political state in the public sphere, if there is a consensus, that consensus is more or less because of a sort of liberal hegemony, which actually makes people believe that that is the right way of doing things, that is the right way of achieving whatever democracy is sort of trying to achieve, and that hegemony is basically the basis of politics. Um, I don't know if everybody knows what hegemony means, but basically it's a Marxist thing, and it's basically something that Marx described in terms of the ideology that the bourgeois create, that makes the proletariat believe that it is in their interest, whatever they're doing, whatever they're being made to do, is in their interest, in the interest of the proletariat. And that's basically what hegemony is. And that's something which has been borrowed into the public sphere, and the liberal hegemony is what basically determines post-political public space. Non-political, what I describe, is something which is a state of an absence of ideology. What basically I mean by this is, it's better to actually explain it with an example. In India, if we look at political parties and the way elections are conducted over the last 70, 75 years of independence, we'll see that political leaders or politicians, they don't actually hold on to any kind of political ideology. And it is such a big problem that in the 1980s, we had to amend our constitution to introduce anti-defection laws. So politicians would not defect from one party to another. And that basically means that if they do defect from one political party to another, it would basically mean that they will be disqualified from their elected positions in the legislatures and the parliament. And in spite of that, last year in January, February in 2020, just before the COVID lockdown started, it happened in one of the states in India, in Madhya Pradesh, and there were 12, possibly 10 or 12 MLAs who actually defected from the Indian National Congress to the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is in power now. And because the number of seats that people hold in these assemblies is like razor thin margin, so the government basically changed from one side to the other, and that defection basically is what keeps happening everywhere in every political party in the entire political space of India. And that defection basically uh, gave me the idea that ideology has no meaning in India. And I will come back to that once more at a later stage in the presentation, why I think that it has no meaning, and why the critique should be in the public sphere. It should be in a sphere, in a state which is non-political, in the absence of an ideological background, and that's what I am trying to do. There is no, I mean, I have in some ways I agree with the leftist ideology, in some way I agree with the right-wing ideology, and there are ideas in the liberal ideology that I in the center as well that I agree with. But at the same time, I do not agree with a lot of things that all these different ideologies hold on to, and therefore for me it is very important that it is a non-political and it is not an ideology-based critique. The second part is that of Eurocentrism. Now, this is something that I mean, I should actually thank one of my colleagues, Agnes Basti, who actually introduced me to the entire discourse on decoloniality and post-coloniality, and I will discuss that in the later slides in my presentation. But this is a very important aspect of the way we actually look at ourselves. And Eurocentrism is something which is a very it is something which is existing everywhere in the world, and there are people in different regions of the world who are basically sort of criticizing it in different ways, and therefore there are different sort of discourses. There is a discourse on self-coloniality, there is a discourse on decoloniality, there are discourses on neo-colonialism, there are discourses on there is an entire theory, the world system theory, which basically criticizes this kind of Eurocentric ideologies and terminologies, and that's basically what I'm going to do in this presentation, a sort of a critique which is taking account of all these different discourses, but also something which is a critique of these discourses itself, where these discourses actually go wrong in terms of what I am trying to actually suggest in terms of specifically relating to Indian democracy. And then obviously there is this whole discourse about democracy, which I would discuss basically how it actually came about, because democracy is a Eurocentric term. It actually developed in Europe, well, at least in Eurocentric societies, even if we accept that democracy also evolved in the United States of America, because it is considered to be one of the first democracies of the world. It was a society which was Eurocentric in character, where it actually developed. It wasn't basically the Native Americans who actually developed the idea of democracy. It was the European immigrants who actually came up with this idea in the United States as well. But that's how it is, that it is a Eurocentric terminology. It is a terminology which is specific to Europe. Whether or not it would apply as it is to India is what the criticism is. And then it is an epistemological critique. I mean, I will explain epistemology as well with example later on in the presentation, what basically I mean by epistemological critique and the problem of epistemology, and how it can be dealt with. So, but to actually explain epistemology in short, it is basically the how basically we acquire knowledge, or interpretation of knowledge itself. If there is a piece of knowledge, how do you interpret it? That is what basically epistemology means. So let's start with democracy. And so what is basically the origin of democracy? And as I said, I mean, it is European in origin. Whether it was Greece or not, it is debatable. A lot of scholars in Europe would agree as well that it is not Greece where it actually originated. Whether it was French Revolution, it could be said that it was French Revolution, because the ideas basically came about during the period of Enlightenment, which coincided more or less with the French Revolution as well. But the First Republic in France, I mean, when Napoleon actually came to power, it probably wasn't a democracy anyway. And if we look at democracy, it probably, as I said, the United States was the first democracy. Even in the United States, we say that it was the first democracy, and obviously the founding fathers constituted it as a democracy, called it a democracy. But in the United States, the universal adult suffrage was basically achieved in 1965. In India, we achieved universal adult suffrage in 1950 with the inauguration of our constitution. 15 years after India, United States achieved universal adult suffrage. So I don't know whether or not I would call United States a democracy at that stage, and we are already seeing the problems States is facing in terms of its democratic um, status today. The kind of things that have happened in the past couple of weeks in the United States and the riots in the Capitol Hill, they are kind of they give us food for thought exactly what where democracy is moving. Uh, but that's one of the aspects of democracy, that it originated in Eurocentric societies. But what actually preceded this democracy in Europe is very important, and how it actually came about. And the thing is, and I would probably refer to Pierre Bourdieu's explanation of how uh, the state actually evolved in Europe. But main aspect, the main thing about this that I wanted to point out is that in Europe, before democracies emerged, there were monarchies, and democracy is basically a kind of a revolt against monarchy. However, even today, in most European countries, monarchy has been able to sustain itself. Even if it is in namesake, it does exist, whether it is in the UK, whether it is in Spain, whether it is in Holland, or any other country as well in Europe. You would find that a lot of countries in Europe, they're not republics. They are basically constitutional, what we call constitutional monarchies, where the monarchies are existing in namesake, but the power basically has been vested with a parliament or a legislature. Uh, Another aspect that we need to look into when we discuss democracy is that of the concept of nation state, which is another Eurocentric concept. And I'm going to compare this with India anyway, whether or not India was a nation state ever, and whether it is a nation state even today, whether we are a nation state or whether or not we are a nation state, it is an open question. So we need to discuss that. But the nation state basically is something which is a Eurocentric concept, and it developed with the idea of the king and the crown. And the king basically was the embodiment of the state, and the state existed because of the king, and therefore in Europe uh, we have states and nation states that exist today as they exist today. Uh, in terms of India, if we look at our history, and I'm going to criticize the way we actually look at our history anyway. But even if we look at our history, whether or not India was a nation state before the Europeans arrived in India, or even before that, is highly doubtful. I don't think that we ever had a concept of state or a concept of nationhood um, that we actually believe in today in the present context. But what exactly was before the Europeans arrived in India? We had something which was we had kingdoms. There were kings, and all across India there were small kingdoms which were scattered around. There were some big empires which were built during our history as well, which we have studied in our history. Uh, but how involved were these empires or these kings or these kingdoms in the day-to-day administration of the people of India is something which I have serious doubts about. And the terminologies that we use, because in terms of European terminologies, we have a state, we have a nation, but in India it was different. It was Janpad. In if you go to Uttar Pradesh in India, one of the biggest states, most populated state in India, north of India, a district, basically, the translation of that in Hindi is a Janpad. What is basically a Janpad? A Janpad is basically a realm where the Jan means the people, where the people basically live. So Janpad is not basically something that you could associate with a king or a leader or a nation state. It is something which is associated with the people who actually live in that uh, realm is basically what constitutes that Janpad. And the same way, terms like Rajan or praja or raj. These are all terms which are associated with a king and a kingdom and the subjects of the king, but they're all focused on the people who constitute. It is not the territory, the geographical territory that constitutes the Raj. It is the people who actually constitute the kingdom in the context of India. And that is also one of the very important aspects that we need to look into when we discuss how democracy works and how democracy should actually be interpreted in India in the Indo-centric way. And I'm using this terminology Indo-centric very specifically, and I will explain it in later slides, why I am using Indo-centric terminologies rather than general terminologies. And then there are the terms that we actually use to describe our democracy in our own language, like, for example, Janatantra, Loktantra, Prajatantra. These are all sort of regimes which are constituted by the Praja, which is the subjects of the king, or the Lok, the realm actually, or the people, the Janatantra. And then there is the term Ganrajya, which is translated into republic, where we actually believe that the leaders are representing the people. So that's something that I wanted to introduce anyway in terms of the Indian aspect of democracy, and we will look into all these terminologies and stuff in the later slides as well. So let's start with how democracy was conceived. Now, okay, I start with Rousseau. I mean, it's something you can start with anybody else during the period of Enlightenment who has actually talked about democracy as well. And I don't actually go into how Rousseau basically describes democracy. I am more interested in the problems of democracy that he describes. And so I will discuss the major problems of democracy that he describes. But one of the important aspects of democracy that Rousseau was trying to describe or sort of conceive was, he probably was not, and I'm not very sure about this from my readings of Rousseau and his criticisms as well, but he probably was not very sure whether he was trying to actually describe a representative democracy. His idea was more of a direct democracy. And he describes the demos who will basically constitute that democracy. And it is a problem, the demos. Because what basically constitute the people? If the people are the source of power in a democracy, who are these people? What is the demos, basically, that constitutes the democracy? The problem that I think that, in my opinion, exists in democracy is that it was conceived in the context of a nation state. Let's say, for example, the French nation state. It is not a small nation state. France is quite a big country with a large population, with a large geography, territorial area as well, and it was quite large even at the time of the French Revolution. It wasn't a small, localized sort of a town or village or something like that. And the conception of democracy, which was created in the backdrop of a nation state, the people basically who constituted the nation state, it was basically a sort of an ethnically homogeneous people, the French people who actually constituted the French nation state. And democracy was basically for all the French people. The problem with demos is, how do you translate the will of the people into the power structures that constitute the state, the institutions that actually exercise power over the same people who are actually legitimizing that power structure. So if it is in the context of a nation state, which is big, it has a big population, then how do you translate that will of the people? And then for Rousseau, the first problem was, how is it different from the general will? So what is the will of the people and what is the general will? So it was conceivable even at that time that people would have different opinions, and there would be some who would be in favor of a certain idea, and there will be some who would not be in favor of that idea and that kind of a structure of democracy. But how would we decide what will be the structure of the democracy or the structure of the power institutions that translate power onto the people of that realm? And so it was, for Rousseau, it was the conception of general will, that, okay, the majority of people, what the majority of people would believe in would be the general will of the people, and that would basically determine how a democracy would function. And that basically brings us to the first paradox that Rousseau describes, the paradox of democratic legitimacy. And it is a problem of majority. And so what exactly happens in democracies, in Eurocentric democracies everywhere in the world, that they are majoritarian in character. In the context of India, I would not say that it is a majoritarian democracy, but I will come back to that at a later stage anyway. And it's not the same thing just with India. It's the same with the United Kingdom as well, and most democracies in the world, because we say that it is a majority, but is it really a majority? In the kind of elections that happen, say for example in Britain or in the United States, it is basically first past the post. Whoever gets the most votes basically wins the election. And so if there are multiple candidates, you don't really need to have a majority of votes in your favor. You just need the maximum number of votes to actually get elected. And that majority in reality is always a kind of an electoral minority. In all democracy, it is the same thing. I cannot say the same about the Fifth Republic in France at the moment, whatever exists in France at the moment, because they have a different kind of system. They have a system of simultaneous elections, which actually makes sure that they have a kind of a proportional representation. So even if the people elect somebody and they may not be their first choice, they may be the second or third choice, but at least they have a majority which is more than 50%. So, and it's still debatable whether or not it is kind of a majority. But that's the first paradox, that how do you legitimize democracy? And the only way to legitimize democracy in this context, in this paradoxical context, is by accepting the general will, which is apparently the will of the majority, but it never is the will of the majority. It is always a very small minority which actually determines what the majority in the nation state would basically be saying. So that's what the first paradox is. The second paradox is the paradox of politics, and it's a problem of norms. How do we determine what is right and what is wrong? It's a question of morals and ethics. So who decides whether or not the law that has been formulated, it is the right law, it is the ethically correct, it is morally correct? Is it the people who decide it, or is it somebody else? Is it something like God or dogma that actually determines what basically is the right way of doing things? In the case of democracy, if it is the people who actually determine the norms, then what is the guarantee that the people will actually choose the right thing, or the people will determine what would be the right thing to do? It basically becomes a question of education as well, not just of education, of accepting that the people know what is right and what is wrong. And therefore it is a problem, it's an ethical and a moral problem, whether or not the people are capable of understanding and determining what is right and what is wrong. And what Rousseau did was, he actually, in order to solve this paradox, he created the concept of lawgiver. At the start of the democracy, there would be a lawgiver who would basically give the law which would be ethical and moral, and then the people would basically follow that law, and therefore it will be a democracy. And to a certain extent, it makes sense. And because I don't remember exactly who said this, probably Diamond or Pattam or Israel, somebody, some theorist in democracy who said this, that if in Iran, if instead of the Khomeini, it was Nehru who was the leader, who was the lawgiver, then it would have been a democracy like it is in India. And so the lawgiver is an important aspect. I mean, we can say this about almost all nation states that exist in the world today. If instead of Lenin it was somebody who was a democratic, so for example Madison, then probably Russia would be a democracy as well. And the same thing in terms of India. If instead of Nehru, the lawgiver was, say, for example, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was the Quaid-e-Azam in Pakistan, who is the father of nation of Pakistan, then obviously, probably India would not be a democracy as it is today. So in a way, that does make a lot of sense, and it could basically resolve the paradox of politics. But the problem is that it is a matter of chance. Who is the lawgiver is basically going to determine whether or not it becomes a democracy or it becomes a authoritarian regime like Iran. So that is the second paradox that Rousseau describes. Now, this same paradox of politics, it has been reinterpreted by Habermas as the paradox of constitutional democracy, and it's a problem of time. How does it work? If in the case of United States, what happened was that the lawgivers basically gave a constitution. They wrote a constitution, and that constitution became the lawgiver, replaced the lawgiver basically as a written document, which becomes uh, the authority and what is right and what is wrong, what should be done. So the constitution basically replaces the lawgiver. But the problem of time is that that constitution was formulated 250 years ago. So does it represent the people in today's time, or does it represent the people who constituted the United States of America at that time? Or even in that sense, whether or not that constitution represents everybody at that time, because when America did become democracy, women had no right to vote. They were not consulted in the formation of the constitution. The blacks, the Native Americans, the Hispanics, they didn't have any right to our constitutional rights. The only people who had a say in the formation of the constitution was the white nobility. Even the white men who were indentured, like the Irish indentured workers, they didn't have any say in formation of the constitution of the United States of America, or for that matter, even the amendments that happened in the Constitution of America later on. Some of the amendments have not even been sort of approved by the states in the United States even till date. But that is a completely different thing. And this problem exists not just in the United States; it exists in every democracy which has a written constitution. Who does this constitution represent, and what time does this constitution represent? And that is the paradox of constitutional democracy. So that is the third paradox that I want to discuss about democracy. And then the fourth paradox is the paradox of populist democracy. I don't know if anybody has heard, especially in India, if anybody has heard of Carl Schmitt. He was a member of the Nazi Party, and he conceptualized democracy on the populist framework. The paradox of populist democracy is not a term that he used. It is used by somebody else while basically critiquing Carl Schmitt's work. But it is based on his work anyway. I mean, if you want to actually go and see who basically describes paradox of populist democracy, just type this term in Google Scholar and you will get all the books and papers. But what basically does the paradox of popular democracy mean? Basically, it is a problem of majority anyways, but it is a problem of demos, because I mean, for Schmitt, the demos was basically the people who constituted the German nation, who were German, as opposed to who were not. And so this is always a problem in democracies, that there would be somebody who would constitute the demos, and there would be some who would not be a part of the demos. And if you look at the condition in India today, that is more or less the same thing. Who constitutes India? Because we see a discourse in India that is going on in terms of patriotism or nationalism. And so there are people who are nationalists, and then there are those who are anti-nationals, or those who are unpatriotic, or those who will destroy the democracy in India. So there is always this conflict, that there is always an other which is evil that needs to be destroyed. And that is the paradox of populist democracy that actually develops every time. And this is something which basically is, it needs to be understood in terms of Eurocentric democracies, that it always exists in a perpetual condition of strife. There is a part which is a majority which will always pull this democracy towards populism, and a democracy does not exist without populism. There is no possibility of a democracy existing, at least a Eurocentric democracy existing, without it being a populist democracy. And on the other side, there is always the other, the evil, the minority, which pulls this democracy towards anarchy all the time. So you will see that in India, it is sort of manifested in the form of Naxals, the Naxalites in the forests, who are basically fighting against the democratic established governments in India, or the separatists in the northeast, or the separatists in Kashmir. So this is the kind of thing that we always face in a democracy, that one part of democracy will pull it towards populism, the other will pull it towards anarchy. Now, how does democracy actually work? It is also very important, because it will introduce a new concept, and that would be the concept of responsibility. So, how does democracy work? It works through power institutions. The will of the people, that cannot be translated without there being a system that actually translate that will into rules and regulations and laws which are applied to the people themselves. And so the only way a democracy can function, it can function through power institutions. And so what happens in power institutions, as Charles Goodsell actually explains this, is there is a rule. The power institutions impose a rule on the people, and then there is a response from the people, whether in favor of that rule or against that rule. And what Professor Satsangi just explained today about the protests that we are facing on the borders of Delhi for the last month and a half, the farmers' protest, it is a response to a rule. So the power institution, the parliament, actually made a law, and then there is a response, there is an opposition to that. It is not universal in character, that everybody has started opposing. There are some people who are supporting that law as well, but there is a response to that, and that response basically means that there is an expectation of responsibility in the exercise of power. So whoever is exercising power is expected to exercise that power responsibly. And that expectation lies with the people on whom this power is being exercised. And therefore there is a response. And the legitimacy of this exercise of power, it comes from the acceptance, the voluntary acceptance by the people that this exercise of power is responsible. And so in the Eurocentric context, we can sort of describe democracy as a regime, as a sort of a power structure which actually translates the will of the power into rule over the people. But I tend to actually describe it in a certain different way, and that basically is democracy is basically a form of a legitimizing order that sustains the close social relationship between the state and the subjects, which is based on representation. And this is a Weberian description. How basically Weber basically describes power institutions, and his description of basically bureaucracy as an institution, basically, and how it is legitimized. Now, for Weber, the legitimation was it could be either through monopoly of violence, either you follow me or I will kill you, and that's how basically the church or the king used to actually dominate the people. Or it could be voluntary, the people accept it, and that's one of the forms of that voluntary acceptance is democracy. Another form of that voluntary acceptance is hegemony, which is the leftist critique, and I do not want to actually go into a lot of detail of that, but that is a valid critique as well, that even if people are voluntarily accepting the exercise of power on them, it couldn't be based on a sort of liberal hegemony. And I keep using the term liberal hegemony because I don't see any other kind of hegemony. And I may be wrong in this, but there is only a liberal hegemony that exists in the public sphere. So that is what basically I keep referring to all the time. But if you can find any other kind of hegemony, good. I don't have a problem with that. But democracy is just one form of the voluntary acceptance of the social relationship that exists between the states and the citizen. And which is basically based on representation, and therefore democracy is a form of legitimacy. It is not a form of regime. It is a kind of legitimacy. Now, in terms of responsibility, and this actually it relates to the paradoxes of democracy that I explained, because this is another paradox of democracy that I have actually been able to sort of figure out. I don't know if this is appropriate, if this is the correct way of actually doing it, but something is amiss in terms of responsibility in the democratic setup, in the Eurocentric democratic setup, and that therefore we need to actually understand responsibility has a locus and a focus. Now, I am using terms from maths and physics, but locus basically is the location, and the focus basically is the center, basically. Say, for example, this the center of a circle or something. But what basically is the locus and focus of responsibility? The locus is basically the institutional where of responsibility. Say, for example, there needs to be a street built connecting two villages in India, or a road that needs to be built connecting two villages, or a village to a city, basically. So there needs to be constructed a road. So who is basically responsible to actually build that road? And there would be, say, for example, the road construction department. So that department is the institutional where. That department is responsible to build that road. But if they do not build the road, who do we blame? That is the focus of responsibility. Can I actually go and blame the engineer who didn't build the road? I cannot. Who will I actually blame? I will blame my local representative, the member of the legislative assembly or the member of the parliament, because that is the person who I will not vote for in the next election if the road is not built. I cannot go and tell the engineer, why didn't you build the road? Because he's not responsible to me. He's responsible to somebody else. So who can fix that responsibility on him, on the engineer, on the engineering department? This is the paradoxical situation. In the Eurocentric model of democracy, what happens is that the locus and the focus, they cannot be realized at the same time and place. It is it's like the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty. If you can determine the time of a body, you cannot determine the place, and if you can determine the place, then you cannot determine the time. At the same time, it cannot be basically determined. Both of them cannot be determined, and that basically is what the locus and focus cannot be realized, because the separation of representation and the implementation institution, this is what it creates. This creates this kind of paradox. In case of representation, only focus is realized, because I can blame my elected representatives. I can put the blame on them. I cannot put the blame on the bureaucrats. I cannot put the blame on the appointed officials who are supposed to actually do that job. But then, on the other hand, in case of implementation, only focus is realized. Only the locus is realized, and focus is not, because the person who I am blaming is not directly responsible for building the road. He cannot build the road. The road has to be built by the organization, the road construction department. So I am blaming somebody else for, I'm holding somebody else responsible for a job that was supposed to be done by an institution which is completely separate. So this is how this paradox of institutional responsibility comes into existence. So either the locus is realized or the focus is realized. Whether or not both of them can be realized at the same time is an open question. I have not been able to find some way of actually doing it, and it is what we actually see all the time in our daily dealings with bureaucracy and democracy in India at all times. So not just in India, I am assuming it is the same thing everywhere in the world, that we cannot directly reconcile these two aspects of responsibility together in the Eurocentric democratic framework. So, okay, I have already spent more than half an hour. I need to go a bit fast. So, I'm going to actually bring this the entire discussion back to Eurocentrism and non-politicality. So, what basically is this whole idea of Eurocentrism? And one of the aspects that I actually started to actually discover in my readings and my research is that the concept of coloniality, the idea that Eurocentrism became universal during the period of colonization, when the European nation states expanded into the rest of the world and colonized the rest of the world. And this, during the colonialism, they actually imparted the modern universalism to everybody else as well. That their conception of the world was universalistic. That was the correct way of conceptualizing the social world. That basically is what modern science is all about, of finding the universal, the objective, the positivistic view of the social world. I don't believe in that, and I'll explain why I don't believe in that anyway. But I mean, it's up to you whether or not you want to believe in that. But it's totally an open question. But in terms of coloniality as well, when I was reading these discourses on coloniality, I found something which was amiss there. And this is specifically with respect to India. And that is why I in the later slides, I will use the term Indo-centric. It is important to understand that it does not apply to other parts of the world. It only applies to India. And why it applies to India is because American, African, Australian colonies, they were isolated social systems before colonization. And the reason I say isolated social systems, because the Europeans did not know of their existence when they colonized them. They might have somewhat, but I mean, obviously, when Columbus discovered America, he actually thought that he had discovered India. And so for him, and that is one of the reasons that, I mean, the Native Americans are still called Indians, which is sort of insulting both to Indians and to the Native Americans, but still, that's a completely different thing. But they were isolated systems because there was no contact between Europe and America. There was very little contact between sub-Saharan Africa and Europe. I mean, the Europeans did go into Africa to hunt for slaves, but they were not basically sort of in sort of a trade relationship, not much anywhere. I mean, North Africa was sort of in relationship with Europe because it was a part of the Roman Empire, but not large chunks of the southern regions of Africa. And the same way Australian colonies. The Southeast Asian nation state that exists today, they were also partially isolated because they were in contact with the West through India. China, Korea, and Japan, they were not colonized, but they were closed systems because, I mean, China built a Great Wall of China just to protect itself, and then it isolated itself from the rest of the world. There was very little interaction that was going on between China, Korea, and Japan and the rest of the world. But India was not a closed system, and that is one of the most important criticisms of coloniality that I have been able to figure out. India was an open system. In fact, at the time when Europeans arrived in India, India was probably the most multicultural society in the world. The Europeans may not have even seen a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Jain, but in India there were Christians, there were Muslims, there were Jews, there were Zoroastrians, the Parsis who were persecuted in Iran, and then they fled to India. Every kind of ethnicity existed in. I mean, there were people from Africa who were living in India. There were people, Mongoloids, who are still part of the Indian nation state in the Northeast. Racially, they are more close to Chinese than to Indians, the South Asians. But they're still part of India. And it was still, at that time as well, one of the most multicultural societies, much more multicultural than any European society at that time. And so it wasn't a closed system which was not in contact with other social systems. It was in contact with Africa. It was in contact with the Asia Minor, the Middle East. It was in contact with Southeast Asia. It was in contact with China. It was also in contact with Europe during the Roman period, and even after the Roman period during the Byzantine Empire, and through its trade routes via the Middle East, it was still in contact with Europe. And the reason I say this is because when Europeans started exploring the world, they actually formed companies, and all these companies, they were called East India companies. They didn't form East China company. They didn't form an East Australia company. They didn't form an East American company or West American company. Every single nation, whether it was Britain, whether it was France, whether it was the Dutch, the Austro-Hungarians, anybody, the Belgians, anybody who actually wanted to actually explore, the Portuguese, the Spanish, everybody formed an East India company. They were all wanting, the focus was India. They were trying to find India. And India wasn't closed. It had interactions with the West. And that is exactly what I am trying to say here, that in cases of other colonies, whether it was the Americans, whether it was the Africans, whether it was the Australians, or any other part of the world, even in Asia, there was a break in history that colonialism created. Their own societies, they stopped evolving at that point because they were isolated societies, and they stopped evolving at that time. And therefore, there was a break in history, which is a valid point in the discourse on coloniality, and I totally agree with that. But it is not a valid point in terms of India. In case of India, all colonialism did was it created an epistemic diversion. And by that, I mean to say that the evolution of the Indian society, or the growth of Indian society, the path that it was taking, that path moved away from a straight line onto a diverted path, which was affected by colonialism. And that was an epistemic diversion. But there is nothing to actually suggest that if that epistemic diversion hadn't happened, the society, Indian society, would not have reached where it is today at this stage. So even if we had followed that straight line path of our own evolution, we would probably have reached here. And that is something which a lot of scholars in India believe as well. I have actually read some of these things. I mean, it is a very often cited argument in India that just because the British came to India and colonized us, that we were introduced to the modern scientific discoveries and knowledge, is not true. Even if they hadn't done it, we would still have actually acquired them, because we were an open society, and we would have actually had relationships with the Europeans anyway, and the modern science would have actually entered into India otherwise. But what that diversion did is also very important. That diversion basically created a sort of a epistemic reinterpretation of our culture, our history, and our society. So, and the best example of that is when we are in primary schools in India, we are taught who discovered America, Columbus, who discovered India, Vasco da Gama. Why is it that we need to understand that Vasco da Gama discovered India? How is it that Vasco da Gama discovered India for us? He may have discovered it for the Europeans, but how is it that Vasco da Gama actually discovered India for Indians? That is something that is incomprehensible to me. And yet, in schools, every single child in our school system is actually taught this. And that is a very important aspect of what basically this means, the reinterpretation in the Eurocentric way. And that basically, okay, let me go to this slide first, because this is important, and then I'll go back to the earlier slide. Lord Macaulay in 1835, he was the one who basically was in charge of the Law Commission in India, and he formulated the education policy. And this is basically a quote, direct quote from him. And for him, basically, the idea was that Indian languages and Indian culture, it wasn't basically, it was kind of a bad thing. And then it was the duty of the Europeans to actually teach us how to actually interpret our own culture and society in terms of the modern scientific knowledge that the Europeans were actually bringing into India. And that's how basically it actually evolved. But and that basically means that now we can basically not see ourselves. Indians cannot actually see our own culture, our own history, our own society in any other way except the modern scientific way that the Europeans taught us. So our history is written by those using those tools that the Europeans actually brought into India, and rediscovered our history in the Eurocentric way. And so we are taught that history in the Eurocentric way because they have been rediscovered by the Europeans for us in the Eurocentric way. And that is how the education system in India is, that we are only taught about the history in the Eurocentric way. Okay, now before colonialism happened, what was basically the and I have already sort of discussed all these things in bits parts in other slides as well. But this is what the main thing is. I'm comparing Great Britain and India in terms of the colonizer and the colonized. So Great Britain was 4 nations. In India, there was no concept of nationality. We didn't have a concept of nationality, and it was not culturally homogeneous like it is for the British. India is culturally diverse. I mean, the same thing can mean completely different things in 2 different parts of India, and it is linguistically diverse. I cannot speak languages that are spoken in the south of India. People in the northeast speak a language which I would probably not understand a word of. The society, the structure of the society in Britain was based on feudalism. In India, it was based on Varnashram, which is the caste-based division of labor. Now, it may be a bit controversial, but I am still going to actually say this. The caste system in India, there were disabilities. Those disabilities during the pre-colonial times existed in Europe as well, in terms of exploitation of women and peasants in feudal societies in Europe. But it didn't become exploitative until the British introduced feudalism to India in 1793 through the permanent settlement, and creating a new class of zamindars and Rai Sahibs and Rai Chaudharis and all those nomenclature that they created to actually identify the landlords, like they used to do in Europe as well, like counts and barons and stuff like that. So the same thing was actually done to India in 1793. In 1793, they introduced permanent settlement, and then before that, land there was no ownership of land. There was no concept of ownership of land in India. Um, when land became a private property, it actually had the effect of introducing feudalism, which was in decline in Europe because of the Industrial Revolution. It introduced feudalism in a very distorted form to India, in the sense that it distorted the original caste-based division of labor. Now, the caste-based division of labor, there were disabilities, but it was still a system of solidarity. In terms of, it is not the division of labor that Adam Smith talks about, it is the division of labor that Durkheim talks about. So the division of labor did not really create an exploitative mechanism before the British actually came. It became exploitative after it was restructured. The caste system was restructured through feudalism by the British. When it became a feudal caste system, then it became exploitative. Before that, it was not. In terms of industrialization as well, the only part of the world which was sort of moving towards industrialization at that time was India. And the industrialization of Britain, or the Industrial Revolution in Britain, and that is something that uh, I forgot his name, the Indian National Congress politician from Kerala, Shashi Tharoor, he actually made this point as well, that the industrialization of Britain was based on the deindustrialization of India. So there were proto-industrialized regions of India where they were actually starting to develop industries. And even when India was basically sort of deindustrialized, we were still able to build up our own native industry, even during the British period. It is not like uh, there was complete lack of industrialization of India even at that time, and it has actually revived a lot in the independent India anyway. But there was something which was very important, and that needs to be understood. At the time when the British came to India, this is just a projection, which is again, I think, maybe biased, because Indian historians like Shashi Tharoor actually pointed out that the contribution of India to the world GDP was 33%, and when the British left, it was less than 3%. So the exploitation that the British uh, contributed, the exploitation of India that the British contributed to, is the reason that uh, we are in a state at the moment that we are, and what people have been talking about, of the exploitation of the poor people and the government not being able to help them. It's because of the lack of resources. But that is not the only thing that the British did. The epistemic diversion that I'm talking about, the English education that was introduced, and the way that it was introduced to India, without having respect for the native interpretive knowledge, native culture, native society, is what basically created this problem. And that is why the problem is that of um, Eurocentrism. And so the discourse on decoloniality, um, this is a discourse which is claimed uh, to be the discourse which has been developed by people who are immigrants, colonial immigrants in European societies. Post-colonialism is basically another Eurocentric term, because that term has been developed by European scholars and not the native scholars of the colonies. I don't know whether decoloniality is a non-Eurocentric term or not, but it claims to be. And Walter Mignolo is the one who actually talks a lot about it. But I mean, I see a lot of native scholars as well, non-European scholars who are working on decoloniality, but I also see a lot of European scholars. The problem is that whether or not it is Eurocentric is not something that I am willing to actually put a finger on at this time. Uh, but the idea of decoloniality is that after the colonial experience, the only way Indians can see themselves is in a Eurocentric mirror. We cannot interpret our own uh, culture, our own society by any other means but the means that the Europeans have given us. So we can only see our culture through the Eurocentric scientific eyes. And that's the only way that we can see ourselves. And that is the problem of Eurocentrism. The system of education, it has reconditioned our brains to interpret knowledge, even the Indo-centric knowledge, only in the way that the Europeans have taught us to actually interpret. And so the epistemology is basically European. The interpretation of knowledge, the acquisition of knowledge is now Eurocentric in character. And that is the problem that we are facing in terms of our own coloniality of our brains, basically. That's what basically this is about. The solution that Mignolo actually suggests is that of border thinking, sensing, and feeling. So border thinking is basically something that move away from the uh, main discourses, the mainstream discourses in any field. I mean, because we're talking about democracy, let's say about democracy. So move away from the mainstream discourses on democracy and move to the border and think about and sense and feel about the colonial uh, way, how you a colonial not basically the colonial, the natives, the people who have been colonized would basically sense or feel about democracy in their own social environment, in their own social way, in their own cultural way. And that's what border thinking is, and then building theories on that. But the problem is, uh, it is a good idea. There is no doubt that we need to move out of the mainstream. But the problem is that it is also an exercise in theory building. The theory building in itself is a very Eurocentric way of doing things. I mean, and then I go back to something which I came up in my discussions with one of my supervisors a couple of days ago. Uh, the idea that we can only interpret our society, or we can see our society only through the um, through theories, or through we can only describe our societies through by building theories, is not something which is very accurate. We can also do it in other ways. And why cannot we do it in some other way other than just building theories? Like, say, for example, by trying to understand our society in terms of blogs. And the example that I gave was that of Gandhi. Gandhi never used to write in terms of theories. He was not building theories when I was writing whatever he was writing. He just wrote small passages, 1, 2 paragraphs in some newspaper, or even if he was writing a small pamphlet, he would just basically write small. And that is basically what blog is. But his conception of the society was in itself something which was, in my opinion, much more Indo-centric as compared to the others, including Nehru and Patel and Ambedkar and all those people who are the founding fathers of the Indian nation. And so for Gandhi, it wasn't about the modern theories on democracy or nation state or sovereignty or rule of law and things like that which mattered. What mattered was what he saw in the society and how he interpreted that. And that interpretation, basically, he expressed it in terms of his pamphlets and his small passages, which we basically today call blogs, because that's how people write blogs on the internet these days. So that is also a way of actually doing understanding society. It is not just by building theories that we can understand society. And that part that we talk about, understanding in a different way. I'm not saying that that is the right way of doing it, but it's a different way of doing it. That is what is called epistemic disobedience by McMurrow. And so his idea is that it is not revivalist, and that is very accurate in the context that you cannot revive the Native American society anymore. It doesn't exist in the state that it used to exist pre-colonization 200-300 years ago. And in any case, I mean, at least in the United States, most of the Native Americans have already been killed. So it's impossible to actually revive that society anymore. And whether or not that revival would be a good thing to do is another issue, because it may not be a good thing to actually revive that kind of a society. However, there is there are other indigenous ways of acquiring knowledge, which are not modern, postmodern, or alternate model. Um, the modern way of acquiring knowledge is the scientific way, that there is it is basically the Eurocentric way in which we acquire knowledge, the way we study science in India and everywhere else in the world. That's how we acquire knowledge. But there are other indigenous ways of acquiring knowledge as well, and that is what epistemic disobedience is. And I will talk about the Indian way of acquiring knowledge as well, because I'm going to introduce the concept of Mimamsa in this presentation. But what is important is that in the Indian context, it should mean epistemic reconstitution of Eurocentrism. It's not that Eurocentrism is bad. And the first slide itself, I said that it was not bad. It is different. It is something in a different way. We interpret knowledge in a different way, in the Eurocentric way. But what is important is that we not only do we need to move away from that kind of epistemic acquisition of knowledge, but we also need to interpret that itself in the Indocentric way. And that is what is the epistemic reconstitution of Eurocentrism. So democracy is Eurocentric in character because we only interpret it the Eurocentric way. But we can interpret it the Indocentric way as well. And other colonies, other places can interpret them their own way as well. I'm not saying that my way is the right way or the Indian way is the only right way, but this is what I think is the way that Indian democracy should be interpreted, the Indocentric way. And then even within India, there will be people who would disagree with me, with my interpretation, my epistemic reconstitution of the Eurocentric model of democracy, and they are welcome to do that. There is, I'm not saying that my interpretation would be a universal interpretation, which basically is the basis of modern scientific theories, but I don't believe in those theories of universality, of positivism, of objectivity. In my opinion, there are different ways of doing it, and we can have a discourse on how to do it in a different way. And that's what basically I'm trying to do with this presentation. So the problem is epistemological. Now, what is epistemology? I already explained that in terms of epistemology, it is how you acquire knowledge. Now, in the Indian context, if you look into the Vedas, there is something which is called Mimamsa. Now, Mimamsa is, you need to break it. In Hindi, we say Sandhi Vichhed. So you need to break the word. What is Mimamsa? It is Mansha. Mansha is something which is related to Mana. Mana is basically mentality. So it's something to do with the mind, and Mansha is basically the mentality or the state of the mental being. And Mimamsa is basically a reflective state of mindfulness. So in the state of reflection, how we acquire knowledge or interpret knowledge. And there are different ways in which the Vedas actually described. The first 5 basically are called the Purv Mimamsa, and the last one is Uttar Mimamsa. So the first one are the basic ones, that you acquire knowledge through perception. You acquire knowledge through inference, through analogy, through postulation, and through enunciation. And the last one is the later on, which is a part of the appendix of the Vedas, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, and that is through non-perception, something that you cannot perceive. Like, for example, the existence of God, whether or not God exists, we don't know. But there is something. It could be intelligent design, it could not be intelligent design. But whatever it is, we do not know, and so that is non-perception. But these are the methods of epistemologically understanding something, understanding a piece of knowledge the Indian way. Now, we started with a concept of democracy being developed in nation state, in the framework of nation states. So what is India? India, the name of India is Bharat. I mean, in Hindi, we call it Bharat. And where does this name come from? In the first, one of the first mentions of the term Bharat is in the text of epic poem of Mahabharata, which is basically one of the two epics that were written somewhere around 1000 to 500 BC. And that epic poem is the story of the country that we call Bharat, the nation that we call Bharat today. So what is basically Bharat? I'm going to borrow a passage from that from Mahabharata, basically not from Mahabharata, it is a part of Mahabharata, it is the Bhagavad-Gita. And there is a passage in there which reads this: Yada yada hi dharmasya glanir bhavati bharata abhyuthanam adharmasya tadatmanam srijameham. Now, this is a Sanskrit text, and it needs to be translated. And so the translation that I have been able to find on the internet is something like this: whenever in Bharat religion will fall into disrespect, I shall be born over and over again to destroy religiousness. So whenever there is something unreligious going on in India, the God will be take birth. God Krishna is basically talking to one of the characters in this story of Mahabharata, and he is explaining to him that I will take avatar, and that's how gods in Indian religious context take avatar and come into the realm of this earth, and then they destroy the irreligiousness and restore religious order, and that's what basically is the translation. Now, I can interpret the English translation that I see here, or I can translate the original, or I can interpret the original Sanskrit text that is there. And how do we actually do the interpretation of the original text? That is the more important, because what we actually do today is interpreting the translation rather than actually looking into the original Sanskrit text. And there are different ways of interpreting it. I have a particular way of interpreting it, which I call the Indo-centric way of interpreting it, and that is the Indo-centric epistemology that I'm talking about, and what basically would constitute Bharat, or the nation that is India. And then there is the Eurocentric epistemology. You can translate it into English and then understand it in the context of the translation. That's what basically we do. If anybody has any sort of arguments or any doubts about the translation that I actually showed you, whenever in Bharat religion fall into disrespect, if anybody has a problem with this translation, please let me know, because this is something which is generally accepted in India. So yeah, now we can translate it into English and we can interpret it. But in the original context, what basically Bharat means? Bharat is basically named after the king, mythical King Bharat. In the poem, there is King Bharat. After him, the people, he's basically called Bharat because he takes care of his people. He ensures the contentment, the bharan of his people. And so Bharat basically refers to the people who are content and satisfied. It doesn't refer to a territory in Mahabharata. It refers to specific regions in India, and those regions can identify today where the battles took place and all those things. But when it talks of Bharat, it doesn't talk of a territory that exists today. It talks of the people. And how is it being interpreted in that term is because Bharat was named from the name of the king Bharat was derived from the word Bharan, which is ensuring the contentment of the people, Bharan Poshan. And so And so when the king was named Bharat after Bharan, what basically means is that the people who he used to rule over, or the people who constituted what constitutes India today, is basically the name of the people. So the Bharat basically refers to the people who are content and satisfied. It doesn't refers to uh, anything else other than, I mean, in fact, in today's context, there would be nobody uh, who would probably be identified as Bharat, because people in India are not content and satisfied. So that's basically what Bharat means. And um, uh, in that same epistemical disobedience, if I interpret the original text of the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad-Gita, it basically means this, that I have actually written down here. Every time the people who are content and dissatisfied lose faith, lose the path of righteousness, because dharma basically is not religion in Sanskrit. It is basically the path of righteousness. Their self, the aham, tadatmanam srijamyaham, aham, the self, the soul, what in the Eurocentric way you may call the soul, it will get reconstructed over and over again in order to annihilate unrighteousness. And that is basically what we have in the Indian religious philosophy, the Hindu religious philosophy, that if you do good deeds, you will go to heaven. If you do bad deeds, you will go to hell. That's something that we probably borrowed from the Abrahamic religions anyway. But the idea that soul migrates from one body to the other until and unless you attain moksha, and moksha will be attained only when uh, you follow the path of righteousness. And so from one yoni to the next, it keeps on going. And that is what is the reconstruction of the self, which keeps on going on until and unless you achieve the path of righteousness. And so the passage that we interpret, we can interpret it in the translated form, and we can interpret it as I have just interpreted it. I may be wrong in that interpretation, but that is one of the interpretations that I can come up with. Others can come up with other interpretations. I'm not saying that this interpretation is the only right interpretation, but this is an interpretation which is not Eurocentric in character. The translated interpretation is a Eurocentric interpretation. This is an interpretation which is not Eurocentric, because this is my interpretation, and I'm not interpreting it in the context of the translated text. I'm interpreting it in the original Sanskrit text. So that's basically what epistemic disobedience would be, and how we need to actually uh, refocus our energies into epistemologically reconstituting the Eurocentric terms. And in this case, we are basically talking about democracy. So let's get back to democracy. Most people in India would probably know what Panch Parmeshwar is, but just to explain this to uh, uh, the people who are not Indian, who are from most of the people from outside India are my friends from Hungary and my colleagues from Hungary. So Panch Parmeshwar is basically the status of panchayats being elevated to the status of gods. In Hindu ritualistic traditions, if there is a religious ritual is being performed, it is being performed by invoking different gods and goddesses, and they are all invited to sit in that ritual and then do it. And that's one of the uh, set of gods is the Panch Parameshwar, the five gods who actually sit in the village under the tree and do justice to the people of the village. And so Panch Parameshwar is also one of the set of gods, and that basically is the epistemic origin of what panchayats would be. Panchayats are basically an institution, and I will explain that in detail in the next slide anyway. Are the institution which have existed in India for a very long time, from the beginning of the Vedic period around 2000, 2500 BC all the way to today. These institutions have existed in villages, and they have they have evolved over a period of time as well. It is not that they're the same as they existed 2000 years ago, but they have evolved and they have reconstituted themselves. But the basic idea is that the Panch Parmeshwar or the Panchayats are the people who actually rule over the village, and how they are constituted is something which I'm going to refer to two uh, texts. One is a 1916 fictional story by Munshi Premchand. Munshi Premchand was one of the great writers of Hindi, probably one of the greatest ever Hindi scholar, and he wrote a lot of things about the society in India, and he interpreted them in terms of fictional stories and novels that he actually wrote. And this is one of the stories that he actually wrote about the Panch Parmeshwar and how it works in Indian society. And this is very contextual because it actually refers to a period of time which was a colonial period. And so it is not a post-colonial period. It is not the period of independent India. It is before that. And at that time, panchayats did not exist in India as they exist today. And so this is important to understand what he actually writes. So it is basically fiction based on real social conditions. And there are two cases of property disputes that he is discussing about. Uh, Now, this is a depiction because it's a fictional story. It is a kind of a depiction of the living memory of panchayats in the cultural consciousness of Indians. And it also depicts the cultural embeddedness of the panchayats in India. And one of the most important aspects, okay, the participation is free for all. That is what basically uh, he refers to. But caste and gender disabilities are completely ignored in this story. Now, it is not that he was not aware of these kind of gender and caste disabilities, and he, in other stories, he actually mentions these things as well. But in this story, he consciously uh, refuses to actually recognize these kind of disabilities. But most important aspect of these panchayats is that the decisions, they do not need enforcement. The state does not need to enforce these decisions because these decisions have been arrived at by the people themselves. So if a panchayat is sitting and making a decision, the people accept it. You don't have to have a police force to actually go and enforce it, a machinery of law to actually enforce that decision. And that is something similar which was found out by Vasudha Dagambar in Haryana. And this is again a very, very controversial example that I am citing, but in spite of the kind of bad reputation that this example might actually bring about, I'm not actually going to actually address the ethical or moral character of this example. The only thing that I want to emphasize from this is that these panchayats, they have social acceptance. Their decisions are automatically accepted, and that's something which is very, very important in terms of the Indo-centric model or the Indo-centric reconstitution of the Eurocentric term of democracy. That in case of these panchayats, you do not need the state to enforce these laws. Okay, this is an example of a Khap Panchayat, and it is a case of bigamy, and there is a possibility, not a possibility, I mean, the decision that was actually arrived at would probably not be a decision which would be arrived at in a court of law. But then the courts of law as well have actually, in some cases, accepted that, okay, you can punish, you can send somebody to a prison for bigamy, but then, but if you sort of refuse to legitimize the second marriage, then if there are kids who have been born out of that second marriage, all those kids would become illegitimate as well. So they cannot actually say that, okay, bigamy is a crime in India, but it's something that you have to accept. Otherwise, you will make a large chunk of the population illegitimate. And so that's one of the things that in a court of law, the same decision might not have been arrived at, and then that decision would have been enforced by the police or the executive branch of the government. But in case of the panchayat, some decision was arrived at which was socially acceptable to everybody in the within the panchayat, and they accepted it freely, voluntarily. And that is what basically is that is what I want to highlight. I don't want to highlight that the decision was wrong. May have been wrong, but what is important to understand in terms of the panchayats is that decisions in the panchayats are accepted by the people voluntarily. They don't have to be enforced, and that is one of the most important aspects of voluntary legitimation of democratic institutions that I was talking about, because I described democracy in terms of a form of legitimacy. And so this is what basically is. It finds legitimacy by itself. It doesn't have to be enforced. Now, the pre-British period and post-independence period is what basically I wanted to compare in terms of the panchayats. Traditionally, it was transient in character because panchayats were not fixed bodies. They were not like existing like the legislative assemblies in the states exist today, or the parliament exists in Delhi today. They were transient body. They were only constituted if and when there was a dispute to be resolved. Otherwise, they will not be constituted. And if there was a decision to be made, and if there was a difference of opinion within the different factions, then there would be a constitution of the panchayats, and that is why it was transient in character. The village was communally owned by the panchayat, and the panchayat decided what to do with the land in the village, or what kind of crops they will grow, or what they will do. And they were self-sufficient communities, the pre-British period. It was voluntarily created by homogeneous groups. Now, this is important because panchayats in the same village, they could be more than one panchayat. And this is important because they, as I said earlier as well, the caste system divided the society in India, and so there could be panchayat based on different castes. What I don't accept is that it was exploitative in nature until feudalism was introduced to India. That's something which can be debated, which you can agree or disagree with, and we can fight over evidence of that as well. And the evidence is that, I mean, we do not see any kind of caste-based conflict before the pre-British period in the history of India. And so if somebody can find an evidence of that, then of course we can have a debate over that. But that's one of the things that is very important. Homogeneity of the group was ensured when the panchayats were constituted every single time that there was a need for a panchayat to be constituted. And now it could be constituted by nomination, it could be done by rotation, it could be done by draw of lots, or it could be elections. It could be any of these methods that the panchayat could be. And these four methods basically of the constitution of panchayat is, I can find reference of this in Panini's original text on Sanskrit grammar, Ashtadhyayi. So, it has actually been referred to by Muhlberger and Payne in the book that they wrote on democracy's place in world history. So it is something from around 500 BC that these kind of methods of constitution of panchayats have been followed in India. Now, the post-independence panchayats are basically Eurocentric panchayats. They are power institutions. They are permanent in character. And one of the important aspects that I have already highlighted before is the permanent settlement paid by the British made land and resources privately owned, and private ownership in the villages has changed the character of the panchayats as well, because private ownership of land has made certain people, certain class of people within the villages more powerful than the others. And that basically has created a different kind of a social stratum in the villages, and that is why it has an effect on the panchayat, the powers and the position of the panchayats in the villages as well. In today's context, it is created by the state through delimitation of constituencies, and the constitution is basically through election. Affirmative action is there in favor of women and socially backward, but then this is a Eurocentric interpretation of the panchayats. And we have not interpreted the panchayats in the Indo-centric way that we should, and then basically reconstitute the panchayats in India. And that is what my main focus is. Now, what is democracy? And I am using the term Loktantra here in terms of the Hindi word that we can use for democracy. Others can use other words. I mean, I'm pretty sure that there would be some words in Tamil as well, which would describe democracy. There would be some in Telugu and Malayalam, some in Gujarati, some in Marathi. There are different languages in different parts of India, and they can have different words for what they want to describe democracy, their way of describing democracy. And the Indo-centric way of describing democracy can also be epistemologically diverse, because India is a diverse society. So the way that I describe democracy, and I call it the Indo-centric way of describing democracy, can be different from what probably a person in South India, in Tamil Nadu or Kerala would probably describe it or understand democracy. And so that is also, even though I use the term Indo-centric, it could be that I may be wrong here in using this term, and if I am, I'm willing to basically actually change it. But that's how I actually move ahead with the understanding of democracy. At this moment, it is impossible to describe India in any other way other than a nation state, because what has happened, and I said it was not a historical break. The coloniality did not create a historical break in India. It just diverted the path of evolution of Indian society. But at the end, maybe we would have arrived at a nation state as it exists today. And so we don't know whether that path would have followed us here, or whether it is something that we would have taken a completely different path, and we would not know it until forever. I mean, we cannot find out what exactly it would be. But that's what basically is. And what needs to be done is an epistemic reconstitution of India as a heterogene nation state. Now, heterogene basically is, it means uncomparable, something that cannot be compared. So it is a nation state, but what kind of a nation state? Is it a Eurocentric nation state? No, I say that it is a nation state in form of a multiverse of panchayats, and that's the Gandhian way, basically, of describing the nation of India. That it's a union of multiple panchayats that exist self-sufficiently within the territorial limits of what we call India today. What it also needs is an epistemic reconstitution of civil societies in the form of panchayats. Now, civil societies, again, is a Eurocentric term, and it exists in India today as well, but that's a Eurocentric existence. And so it needs to be reconstituted in the form of panchayats. There is need for elections, because you cannot translate power to a large population without elections or without representation. And that's why I describe democracy as a legitimizing order, which actually determines the social relationship between the state and subject, which is based on representation. Sorry. So there must be election, but should it be geographic? The delimitation of constituency, should it be geographic, or can we have non-geographic delimitation as well? Do we need political parties? I mean, if political politicians in India keep switching political parties all the time, do we need political parties, or can we just have independent candidates who can fight elections? Abolition of political parties is one of the recommendations that I make, because in my opinion, political parties are also Eurocentric in character, and it creates political competition, which is a Eurocentric. The political competition is Eurocentric aspect of democracy. It is not an Indian aspect of democracy. The freedom of choosing representation after election. This is also very important. I mean, once the election happens, we are stuck with a leader, whoever has been elected, and the election has happened on a first past the post system. So whoever gets elected, we are stuck with that leader. Should we have the freedom to actually choose our leaders after election? Once the pot is full of the represented elected leaders, can we pick somebody and say that, okay, okay, my constituency has elected this leader, but I don't want him. I want someone else to actually represent me in the parliament or in the legislature. That is something which is important. And the idea actually came to me when I was discussing this problem with one of my school teachers. He used to teach me maths in high school, and he actually explained to me that um I think Frank would know this better because it's about the gerrymandering that happens in terms of determining the constituencies through which elections happen, and the shape of the constituencies can be like a banana or whatever they want it to be. So to just make sure that the person who is fighting election from that region gets elected. So he explained to me that in his colony in which he lived, there are no streets, and that is true. I actually visited him, and there were no streets in that colony. And he went to his local politician, and he said that there are no streets, and you should build these streets. And he said that uh, I know that you are not going to vote for me, and I don't need your vote, so I will not build the streets in that locality. So how is that a representation? It should be free for people to decide who they want to be represented by, and that's what basically uh, I want to recommend in this case. Uh, Another aspect is that of power institution rationally restructured in the image of panchayats. Now, this is something that can take another hour to discuss, and another presentation as well, because I have developed this concept of structured rationality, and we can do it in some other time. But this is something that is very important as well, and we need to discuss this at some stage. Uh, and then there is the bottom-up division of legislative and executive power. You cannot have uh, 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 the the power institution sitting at the top decide what the people can decide and what the people can choose on what issues, who can make laws and who can make rules and regulations. It should actually come from the bottom. The people should actually decide whether or not they want somebody else to actually legislate on that. And so it should stay with the panchayats at the bottom. If they find a problem which relates to more than one village, then they can constitute a panchayat which would probably form more than one village, which would probably have the participation of that sort of village representatives, and then it can go from one representative status to the other. And so it should be bottom up. It should go from the bottom all the way to the top, rather than coming from the top in the form of the constitution. And the last thing that I would like to actually say before I end this presentation is that the Constitution of India is very Eurocentric in character. We say that we, the people of India, give to ourselves this constitution in the preamble. But the constitution is 85% Government of India Act 1935, which was enacted by the British in the British Parliament. Everything in that constitution is British. We have not done anything. That constitution does not represent the people of India. There is no doubt about it. If somebody says that it does represent the people of India, they are lying, they are misled, and they are completely, in my opinion, they are living in a fool's paradise. Sorry. There is no doubt that the way that democracy functions in India, it is not an Indian democracy. It is a democracy which was conceived in Europe, and it was brought to India by the British, and it has been established in India by the British, not directly, but because of their epistemic diversion through the education system that they introduced to India. That's basically what my whole focus is in terms of the criticism of the Eurocentric model of democracy. Thank you very much, everyone, for the patient hearing. That if you want to take a break, or if you want to start the discussions on this, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Sumit. Thank you for such a nice talk that you have presented here, and we really had a lot of knowledge by your talk. And now we have a lot of people sitting around here, a lot of speakers, a lot of knowledgeable persons, academicians, and may I request all of you to please interact with Mr. Sumit Kumar, and if you have any queries, questions, and you can also give your comments, your opinions. You can share the knowledge on the same. If you have to do say something on it, you please share the knowledge, and you can interact with Sumit Kumar also, ask questions, interact with him. Anyone who wants to do? Dr. Wesley, it seems you want to ask something.
Can I raise some questions regarding the
Yes, yes,
presentation?
Kim. Yes, Kim. Mignon Kim is from South Korea, and she is a research scholar in history, and she is doing research in history in Jawaharlal Nehru University. So she wants to ask something, Sumit. Yes, Kim. Go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thank you for the presentation, Dr. Kumar. I truly appreciated your thought regarding Indian democracy. Although I think several historical facts you mentioned should be corrected, if you don't mind. I believe comparing the case of India in terms of democracy with countries located in Northeast Asia may not be fully appropriate if you approach from the notion of open environmental condition, because case of China and Japan, these countries were constantly having contact with European world through Jesuit Catholics and traders mainly from Netherlands. In case of Korea, Korea was actually colonized by Japan for 35 years. Before that, France has invaded Korea due to Catholic priests from France were executed in Korea. So I think using these countries' case for explaining India's unique environmental condition for democracy may not be fully appropriate. And the democracy of Japan, as you know, was implanted by US after the Second World War, as Japan lost in the war against US, and uh, that's how Korea could be independent from Japan. So again, about your thoughts regarding the Indo-centric democracy, I was very impressed. But then still, I was wondering how the notion of Indo-centric democracy can be developed in the context of political environment of India, because creating Indo-centric democracy, it sounds fabulous, it sounds very legitimate, but at the same time, this notion of localized democracy has been abused by many non-European countries. For example, China, Singapore, they call themselves democratic countries, which we know it is not fact, by the way. So by these countries, this notion of localized democracy has been used to justify distorted or oppressive way of political regime. So how can the term Indo-centric democracy avoid to fall in that trap like those other countries?
Sumit, you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your feedback. Okay, the first thing that I wanted to clarify is that in any case, I am not saying that Korea, China, and Japan didn't have contact with Europe. All I am saying is that the kind of uh, and the other the more important thing is that they were not colonized by during the colonial period. So China was not a colony, Japan was not a colony during the colonial period, and this is a criticism of coloniality. The only thing that I did was I was differentiating between other colonies in the rest of the world and India, and my focus was that even though India was colonized, there was, even before the colonization, there was interactions that was going on between rest of the world. So there may have been interactions between China, Japan, Korea, and Europe and the rest of the world. And I'm not saying that they didn't have, but the societies that these kind of societies in China and Japan and Korea, they were still isolated. They were not multicultural societies like India was. So that is the difference that I am trying to point out. Not just religious cultural differences, but also linguistic differences. Diversity in India was much more pronounced as compared to the rest of the world, or whatever colonial regions that we try to discover. Uh, in terms of my conception of Indo-centric democracy, there is a kind of, as you say, yes, it can be used by vested interests in order to justify something which is not democratic, and used like it is being used, say, for example, in China by the current regime of China. They can call themselves democratic, but whether or not they are, it is debatable. And that is something that can be used by um, political groups in India as well. If I develop this concept that it is an Indo-centric democracy, and it is not something unique, because I mean I am conducting my research in Hungary, and in Hungary there is this concept of illiberal democracy, that the regime that is in power in Hungary has actually developed for itself, that it calls itself an illiberal democracy. Whether or not it is a democracy, it is again debatable. But my focus is not on giving any political regime any legitimacy. My focus is on the scholastic aspect of developing a model which is not Eurocentric, which is Indo-centric. And so for me, it is more about creating a model that may or may not be perfect, but it can be used um, as something that can be that people can actually run with in terms of developing a model of democracy. I hope that satisfies your
Yes,
questions.
thank you for the clear explanation.
Yeah, thank you, Sumit. And anyone else? Dr. Giri, are you there? Dr. Wesley, you want to ask something? Want to discuss?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, please.
Then, sure, I try to be short. Sumit, so there are two aspects of your concept of Indian democracy I want to discuss. The first is an academic issue. So if you study political systems, if you study religions, if you study social stratification, you can't have nation-specific concepts, because then you cannot compare any of them, and you will have much smaller and smaller units, and then every unit will have a different concept on the basis of which it can be analyzed. So that is a problem, and it is a problem, an epistemological problem, very serious one. So I would say if you create or construct a concept of Indian politics, a concept of Indian democracy, you have to use this Indian concept to be to describe Western societies as well, right?
Okay.
So in the same way, so let's say if you do religious studies, basically religious studies all over the world use the Eurocentric concept of religion that doesn't fit Buddhism, for example, at all, the Hinduism either. So the basic concept does not fit it, and yet the whole international academic community speaks of the study of religions, and already Indian scholars describe what the beliefs and the cults in India as religion. And I mean, it's inescapable, right? So that is one problem, and it's an epistemological problem, and I'm really curious how you solve it. The other one is just clarification. So there is this panchayat, right, in a village, right? And they make a decision, and then and people accept it, right? It doesn't have to be enforced, it is spontaneously accepted, all right. What happens when there are 3 villages involved, each have their own panchayat, and they have different decisions, and they have to be somehow coordinated, because all 3 are affected. Or that's one thing. And the same problem is for me is that other higher levels panchayats up to let's say the state level, or So I don't see how they cooperate, how they are coordinated, and so on. And the one about elections. So you make elections, someone is elected, but you don't really like the elected person, and you want to be represented by someone else. Is it an individual who changes, who makes this choice, or is it a community? The community that took part in the election. But if it's an individual, I understand it. Okay,
Yes,
so
I
this
understand.
is
Yeah.
clarifications just because I.
Oh, okay. So the first part, the epistemological problem that you described, it is a problem, and it is a problem that needs to be sorted out. I understand that, and that is a big problem, because not only do we need criticize the Eurocentric epistemologies of Indian democracy, but we need to, at the same time, understand Eurocentric democracy from an Indian point of view, and that is an epistemological problem, and that needs to be understood before we actually describe an Indo-centric Indian democracy. So that is one of the aspects, and that is why I said that it is not um, the idea of Eurocentrism is not bad. I accept that it is a very good thing. There are very important aspects in Eurocentrism that we need to actually apply to democracies everywhere in the world, and those are some of the universal ideas that came up during the period of Enlightenment, and I don't dispute those ideas. The problem is that not all of those ideas can be applied universally, and that is why we need to develop these kind of epistemic disobedience, what Mignolo calls. But the other part, yes, in terms of how we can structure the democratic organizations or institutions to actually get get a kind of a sort of a formula which will translate the will of the people uh, at a level which is more than, say, for example, one panchayats, as you explained. So there could be something which would be affecting multiple panchayats, and so how do people actually come to that decision, whether or not there would be a consensus on that. But then that is what basically I was talking about. It needs to be epistemically reconstituted in the image of panchayat, the institutions. So there are institutions which exists in India, even today. So there are, at the bottom there are panchayats, and then there are at the district level there is a Jila Parishad, where all the members of the panchayat sit as a council and make decisions. But the problem is that uh, it is the structure of these institutions which exists in India at this time. These are all based on the Eurocentric ideas that were brought to India by the British, and because of that, the transient character of panchayats has been lost. So people are not voluntarily choosing who will be the decision maker in what decision is to be made, because panchayat is not the only thing. There is, in addition to that, there is uh, an appendix to that which is called the Gram Sabha. The Gram Sabha is basically every member of the village basically sits down with the panchayat and makes the decision, and that is why it doesn't need to be enforced. And that basically needs to be interpreted in the larger context, that okay, say for example there are multiple panchayats who are affected at say for example the district level, then the people need to choose what kind of decisions these representatives can go and make on their behalf in that council. And if the people disagree, then the representative should not actually enforce that upon the people of that particular panchayat. And that in itself needs to be reconstructed to and that is why I said this is a concept that I have developed in terms of structured rationality, the structuring of the institutions. And there is a very important aspect of that structured rationality, that use of information technology. And it could be said that when India became independent in 1947, this could not have been done. But we cannot give this excuse today, because in today's world, we can actually do that people can directly be in touch with their representative live at the time when the decisions are being made. And so if people are interested, they can actually participate in that decision making process as well. And so that is something that is a completely different aspect of uh, the structural aspect of Indo-centric democracy that I would probably like to discuss, but that would basically mean another big presentation like this one, and so that will need to be discussed in. And I remember this because you asked me this question of describing structured rationality before as well, and I have actually written a paper, and I will send it to you as well. But it is something that needs to be described more in more detail. It is not complete. It is not conceptualized fully yet. It needs to be done.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sumit. But I would like to mention one thing here, that as you said that the village panchayats and the elected leaders are not easily accessible to the public in a democracy. That does it mean it is a democracy, real democracy, true democracy? I ask you by the name of true democracy. Is it called? Can we call it a true democracy? Because when democracy, we say democracy, it means of the people, by the people, and for the people. The moment you are elected, you get a seat and you are in power. As you were discussing about power, I will not take too much of time because I can speak too much on this because I have been seeing the ground realities in India. But when they come into power, then the public is totally out of their agenda and they are not accessible despite being easy access to them. But they are not, people are not accessible, they are not meeting the people. And why does this happen? Because of greed, because of selfish desires, motives to do for self. Because when it is a democracy of the people, by the people, for the people, you are on oath to work for the people, which means for the nation. As you said, for Bharat, why did that Bharat name came? Bharat means Bharan and Poshan, is the nurturing and the bringing up of a small child, how you are taking care of it. Like that, the king has to take care of the people. But here what is happening? Entirely different after getting into power. Before you come into an election, at the time of election, you come and you are posing before the people of this country that I want to become your servant. I will provide all services to you like a servant, day and night, stand by you, whether it is a health problem, education problem, sanitation problem, anything, I will stand by you, your side, and do all your work. And you please, like a king, you please, they will bow down, beg, and they will take the votes. And after they get into power, they become the kings, rulers. And these people who voted as kings, they become not servants, they become slaves. Whose slaves? The slaves of those powerful people. Then what happens? The entire thing is contradictory. So the things which are written on the paper, because you have done so much of research, you have worked so hard on these things. What actually in practical is happening, I would like to take Dr. Giri online. Dr. Giri, what I am saying is right or wrong? Democracy, if you say it is a Eurocentric democracy or whatever, democracy has it has some contents. You can broadly take some of the contents from there, use it for your own area, and that is why you are saying that it needs to be changed. It needs to be modified. Unless you modify, things will not be as good as for that particular area. Like, for example, if you are talking of India and we use the democratic setup and all those constitution and everything of the UK or US, then I don't think it's going to work here, because the poverty condition, the economic condition, the education system, everything is absolutely different from that of those countries. So you can use those broad things here and change and modify according to your own area. Am I correct, Sumit?
Okay. The first thing that I would like to say is that there is no true democracy anywhere. This concept that there can be a true democracy is in itself fallacious. There is no possibility of there having any true democracy anywhere. It's a fallacy that was probably created by modern scientific thought. and it cannot exist. It is not possible to have a true democracy. So that idea that you can have a true democracy in itself is something that I would probably not go ahead and discuss anyway. But the other problem that you're talking about, that people get elected and then they become sort of feudal lords, that is a problem which I described. It is a problem that was brought to India because of coloniality, because of the introduction of a feudal structure into India, that actually created this kind of a exploitative social structure, which actually, in conjunction with the existing social structure of India, because that feudalism was supplanted into India, it created a new kind of structure, which was in a way feudalistic in nature, and uh, it enhanced the exploitative uh, aspects, or for that matter, the capabilities of the social structures that existed in India. And that exploitation has continued way past the independence as well, after independence as well, because the institutions, the structural institutions that existed in India before independence, the laws, rules, and regulations that existed in India before independence, they have not changed. They're still Eurocentric. They're still based on what the British framed for us. The laws, say for example, on sedition, they still exist in India. It is a law in India, and people are exploited. There are people. We talk of freedom of speech and expression, which was okay. Freedom of speech and expression was something which was added to the constitution. The British didn't give us. The British actually enacted the Rowlatt Act, and against which Gandhiji actually did the Rowlatt Satyagraha to actually fight for the freedom of speech. But the problem is that that law that the British created on sedition, that is still being used against people in India today. There are people in India who are in prison right now. There is a stand-up comedian in Madhya Pradesh who is in prison for the last 2 weeks because he said something about Hindus, god and goddesses, which was something like offensive for somebody, and then he is sitting in prison for the last 2 weeks. So it is not something which is which can be fixed in a day or two, or just by me writing a concept on a piece of paper. It is something that needs to be taught to the kids in school, and that is why I say this is an epistemological problem. It is a problem of epistemology. The education system that Macaulay changed in 1835, that actually created this problem. We need to actually stop learning that Vasco da Gama discovered India. It is not Vasco da Gama who discovered India. We are Indians. So that education system needs to turn towards Indocentrism rather than the kind of Eurocentrism that exists. And until and unless that happens, you will not be able to fix that problem of feudalistic mindset of the political leaders that exist.
Okay, when you said that it cannot be a true democracy, Dr. Giri, I would like to take you on this question to you also, because you are a very senior professor in international relations, and you are working on democratic setup. And Dr. Wesley, I will like your comment also on this, that why can't we then say that it should be called a dictating democracy? Neither a dictatorship nor a democracy. When it is a democracy and you are dictating terms to the people of the country, then why can't we say it is a dictating democracy? Can we say like that?
You can say whatever you feel like.
No, that's okay. but in a
you
democracy,
will have to define. The problem with us as scholars is that if you say something, you have to define it. You have to. I mean, I don't define it; I describe it. So you need to describe it, and then it can become a part of the discourse. So it's like I said. I use the term illiberal democracy that is being used in Hungary a lot. So there is a kind. So that needs to be described as well. So if you say it is a dictating democracy, then you need to describe it and create a discourse on that. That's what is needed.
okay, anyone else wants to discuss something? Dr. Giri? Dr. Giri, are you there? Yeah, Dr. Frank, yes, please. Unmute your audio and please.
Hi, Sumit. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Getting the sense of the overall presentation is a challenge. There was so much detail.
Sorry about that.
Oh, don't be sorry. This is a good sign. Which means, I'd like to pick on you for a few of your details in the hope of strengthening the argument. Okay. So I was a little confused when you described the system whereby a representative, which was not my preference, I could change the representative somehow.
Okay, I will explain that.
Okay. Now, obviously, if a representative does not have legitimacy to carry out her job, then there's no representation. So what I was reminded of, though, sort of a compromise position, is what a lot of the American states use is the concept of recall. When the constituents are not satisfied with the work of the representative, then with a mechanism, with an institutionalized mechanism, they can basically cancel the representative's remit. Okay, and vote for another one at the same time. Also, parliaments have votes of confidence in the executive, which is a similar process. So, if my analogy is good, then we're looking at more commonality than difference between the Eurocentric and Indo-centric approaches. So I think you will see a lot of parallels. Everything you said about Indo-centric approach to democratic life, I think you would find parallels in Western societies, although those parallels may not have been institutionalized in the political system through that evolution. Okay, I was fascinated by this idea of no such thing as an ideal democracy. And you and I have had these conversations before. Democracy is an evolution toward an ideal, but it would be naive to think it fits that ideal. And I think you can use that to describe the evolution of American democracy. Certainly, the democracy at the time of the founding fathers to us seems undemocratic. To them, it seemed very democratic. Okay. And as you see the evolution of the expansion of the franchise, and I agree with you, as the mid-1960s were that, well, there's still challenges in the franchise. And you actually see something in America which it seems quite unique to me, is efforts to constrict the franchise.
Yes.
Okay, so fascinating stuff. Now, I was very concerned when you talked about abolishing political parties.
Yeah, I knew you would be.
Yeah. Well, you know me. First is the discussion of rights didn't come up very much in your presentation, but you can't abolish parties without abolishing freedom of association.
No. Okay. I disagree, but okay, you complete and then I'll say something.
Now, you might say freedom of association is a Eurocentric approach.
No.
Okay? But that doesn't fit the rest of your argument. Okay. Another thing is parties bring efficiency into the political system. Okay. So if you do give up on parties, you have to answer how the efficiency of the system will work. The use of resources in elections, for example. Okay. But there's another problem with that argument is you can get rid of parties. That doesn't get rid of competition.
Yes, that's true.
Parties are not the cause of competition. Parties are a mechanism of competition. Okay, so if you run 1,000 individual candidates, there will still be competition. That's the essence of elections. Okay, so part of the framework of your talk is sort of a tension between consensual democracy and competitive democracy. Okay, and there's no question that elections are a tool of competitive democracy, but they are efficient. They are very efficient. My friend, I have lots of more notes, but I think over a coffee, because I don't want to hog the time.
Definitely, we can have a coffee and then discuss it. But I will explain the first part about the thing that I said, representation after election. And this idea actually came to me from NHS, the National Health Service in the UK. People can actually choose which doctor they want to go and register. There are doctors all over UK, and you can choose which doctor you want to actually register with, and then that doctor becomes your general practitioner. And the same thing, you can have an election, and in the constituency, there may be 30% of the voters who actually voted for candidate A, another 29% voted for B, and the B basically lost the election because A had more votes than B. And even though it was a minority, a lot of people didn't want him elected, but he got elected. So
then you're thinking of proportional representation.
No. I'm coming to something different completely. So that person did get elected by first past the post system, right? But a lot of people didn't want him get elected. So what choice do the people have in terms of what can they do in terms of making that informed choice who they want to represent in the parliament? So in Indian parliament, there are 543 members of parliament. So people should have a choice after the election to make another choice. Okay, I didn't vote for this guy who actually won from my constituency, but I want somebody in Tamil Nadu who I think is much more better, and so I will actually ask him to represent me rather than the guy who actually won the election from my constituency. So that is what I am talking about in terms of representation after election. You need to have a choice that you can have a freedom to actually choose somebody else as well who you want to actually represent you, rather than being stuck with the one who you have been dealt with because of the gerrymandering that the people did in terms
of but you're the one who brought up Habermas. That would be a function of the public sphere.
I understand
continue the process of representation through dialogue after elections.
Yeah, but I believe I said that in the public sphere, I do not believe in a political approach or a post-political approach. I believe in a non-political approach in the public sphere, which basically means that I do not want people to adhere to a particular ideology or a political, and that basically brings me back to the political parties that you said, how do you abolish them? Now, I'm going to give you an example. In India, local elections, if you forget about the national elections and the state level elections, if you come down to municipal level and the village level, panchayat level elections, there are no political parties. Every candidate is an independent candidate. They get elected, they go to the municipal corporation, they sit as a council, and they make decisions. So efficiency is not actually, they form their own kind of coteries there, but they do not belong to any particular political party. I mean, in the bigger municipal corporations, like if you go to the metropolitan cities like Delhi or Mumbai, there would be political parties who would be fighting elections in that. But the smaller towns and villages, nobody has any political affiliation.
But what you describe is not unique to India, it's unique to democracy. Because it is an efficiency issue, because at the local level, there's personal knowledge of candidates.
Yes.
Which cannot happen at higher levels.
Okay, that is something that I disagree with in the present context of information technology. You can have a direct contact even with your leaders. I mean, Prime Minister Modi actually boasts of a lot of followers. I don't know, millions of followers on his Twitter account. Same thing Donald Trump did, that he was basically directly in touch with his voters. So that's the same thing that politicians do. They are directly in touch with their voters. They can claim that, whether or not they are, I don't know. But there is a possibility now that you can be directly in touch with the person who is representing you. And that is what I am saying in terms of applying structured rationality to these political institutions. So that's one of the things. And then the other aspect that you talked about, competition. Now, I
want to say something. Saying something and actually happening. There is a lot of gap in India. Saying that we are in touch with the people is one thing, but when it comes to getting in touch, it is through digital contacts. It is not one-to-one physical contact, number one. Number two, when it comes to digital contact, then the servers are not working. You go on contacting, you will not get the telephone numbers. You are not allowed to contact otherwise. So saying something, getting in touch really is, that's why I call on every aspect I add two words, in true sense. Is it there? Is the democracy prevailing in true sense? That's what my question was. And if it is not prevailing, if I am not allowed to be an engineer in true sense, then why do I go for a BTech or an MTech? Why do I go for an engineering course? Let us leave that.
Sorry to interrupt you, but this is what we were discussing. I mean, democracy is something, a term which is continuously in evolution. It is not a finished product, and it will evolve until infinity. It is like a mathematical theorem, limit democracy tends to infinity. It will go on evolving as we keep on discussing all these things, and they can be different sort of understandings or interpretations of democracy that we can have. And the other aspect that you said, that what exists in reality, we can say that they're not in touch in the reality. Okay, fine, I agree with that. They're not in touch within reality, but there is a scope. That is what I'm saying. There is a possibility that they can be. And that's what we were discussing when I said that at a small level, the representative is personally known to the voters, but even at a national level, there is a possibility that the elected representative and the voters, they can be in direct contact. Whether or not that possibility is realized is completely different. But coming back to one more topic that Frank actually talked about, and that was competition. And I just need to say a couple of things about competition. I mean, I don't have a problem with competition. I think it is a very good thing, and it should be there in democracy. The competition must exist in some form or the other in democracy. But what I don't like is biased competition or sort of weighted competition. Competition should be free. Everybody should have a free chance to compete, and that is what basically is restricted by political parties, because political parties, and okay, you can say that I am wrong, but Roberto Michaels actually said that they are oligarchic institutions, and they are oligarchic institutions. At least in Indian context, political parties are oligarchic in character. I don't know. I mean, of course, it is the same in UK and USA as well. They are oligarchies, and that is an iron law. There is no doubt about it. So that is something that we can have another debate on. The political parties do not allow free competition. They allow competition. They make competition available, but it is not free competition. And that is what I mean by saying that political parties need to be abolished, and then the competition would be free. And so that is the reason I don't say that the Eurocentric model, and as Professor Wesley said as well, we need to actually epistemologically interpret the Eurocentric democracy the Indo-centric way. And that is an epistemological problem. But the things that Eurocentric democracies have introduced into India, I'm not saying they are wrong. I am just saying that they need to be reinterpreted in a way that it applies to India properly. It applies to India the right way. And so the competition part is not something which I sort of disagree with. It should exist, but not the political kind of free competition.
No, you are right, Sumit. Competition is never a wrong thing. And Dr. Frank, I also agree that competition has to be there, but it has to be a healthy competition, number one. Number two, when it comes to election in India, now the situations in India have changed. So democracy has to be redefined in India. It has to be reconstituted, everything, because at the lower level, when you said that the councillors in the lower level and the panchayat people are in touch with every resident of the area, every person in that area, is wrong now. Because now, when it is not on the papers that they belong to this political party, but they are totally influenced with the political parties who are in power at that time. Who are...
Yeah, that's why I said that ideology does not exist in India. Political ideologies do not hold any ground in India.
And now this situation is different now. And now you see election symbols. Election symbols are one thing. People are uneducated. Most of the people are illiterates. They don't know who is the candidate. They are just voting to an election symbol. What is that election symbol? Why does that election symbol should exist? The photograph of the person, the candidate can be given, and they should vote the candidate if the candidate is okay. But the things, the administrative things are not okay. They should change these system. Unless they change the system, what is happening is a particular election symbol is winning, and they are not working for the country.
Who is the they that you are referring to here?
That is the question. Who is the they? So then, when you
talk about democracy, who is going to change that?
No,
the people of India.
When you
not going to be anybody else.
So when you talk of this, then you need to have a clear-cut intention. You need a willingness, and unless you have the willingness and intention, you can't get into a right kind of a democracy. So democracy will go on like this. They will say democracy, but it will be it will be on dictating terms. So that's because I am working on ground realities. I am not a researcher. I have not done any research on these things, but I have been working on ground realities, so I know what is happening to whom. Anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I agree totally with
that. Anyone, Dr. Satsangi, you want to ask something?
Yes, I would like to comment. First of all, I congratulate the speaker. It's a very detailed lecture, I should say, very philosophical, analytical. It's a kind of collective review. Learned speaker has traced the history of India from the Vedic call to the days of Muslim rulers, before that Buddhism also. And then he talked of colonization and decolonization. And then he came to the present system of independence, British system, British rulers were there. And now it has come to the present system, the panchayat system, the Panch Parmeshwar. But I would like to say that he has not emphasized the most important factor in our democracy. That's the people of the country. Now, what you call as Janta Janardhan, they are also very much part of it. And whole democracy, whether you say Euro-Centric democracy, will depend upon the people of India. I'll give you an example. Suppose you are traveling in a jet, and the question is, who will fly the jet? And there comes a person, a pilot, who is very well trained. He has 20 years of experience in flying the jet. And he says that you let me fly the jet, and he will reach. And then comes the other pilot who is not properly trained, who has no experience, but who is very eager to become popular and become the pilot, and he offers that that I am going to allow you to travel in business class. I will provide you and some of you can even fly. Most of people will go and vote for the second flight. And then you will fly the jet. Now this is what is happening in our country. Some political parties, they are offering free electricity. Some offer a free water supply. Some of them put a lot of funds in the people's accounts, and they will definitely vote for them. And no doubt, the jet will crash. And who suffers are the greedy people who wants the thing to come for the free. Second thing in India, I don't think we can talk of democracy, which is non-political. Now here democracy is not only dependent on the political parties, but there is much of religion is involved in this. And not only religion, there is casteism involved in this. There is regionalism is involved. When you talk of election, there are certain people, certain group of people, like 15 crores of people, would not like to vote for a certain party. And they will call it that it is a religious oriented party. So no vote out of these 15 crore people will go to that particular property. When we talk of casteism or categorism, then almost 50 crore people will not vote for a particular party, a particular person, because they know that they want some vested interest. And they know that if they vote for a party, it's going to provide them with reservation, provide them with a lot of seats and votes and money. So they will certainly go for it. They will not take things like a democracy. Number three, when it comes to election, particularly if I have no faith in election, because I know if I go and cast a single vote, it won't matter where 15 crores of people are voting with a vested interest. And therefore, the Plato said the vote is different. Like if ordinary man has one vote, let the teacher have 10 votes. Let the philosopher have 100 votes. Let the philanthropist have 1,000 votes. Not that kind of thing. If I being a teacher, if I being a doctor, if I being a educated person and a philanthropist, if I know